Hello, good morning, and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. These are the topics that we shall be discussing today. If you need the PDF of this session, that shall be available on my Telegram channel. The link to join my channel is provided in the video description. Let's get started and let's look at topic number 1. Prime Minister Modi is on a 2-day visit to Mauritius. Now, the relationship between Mauritius and India, the ties between the two countries are very strong. One reason also is that nearly 2/3 of the population of Mauritius is of Indian origin. Today is 2025. 10 years ago, in 2015, Prime Minister Modi had visited Mauritius, and thereby something was announced called Sagar. And what is Sagar? Security and growth for all in the region. This was an attempt by the government of India to put the Indian Ocean back on one of the topmost priorities of India's foreign policy. So 2015, Prime Minister Modi visited Mauritius, announced Sagar, security and growth for all in the region. This was one attempt by India to ensure that Indian Ocean is put at the top of India's diplomatic agenda. And now, 10 years later, Mr. Modi is on a visit to Mauritius again, and there the highest honor is bestowed on the Indian Prime Minister. But listen to me carefully. Look at the strategic location of Mauritius and how it is important for India and the geospatial location. Now, listen to me carefully. If you look at Mauritius, despite the fact that 2/3 of its population is of Indian origin, but India should not consider Mauritius as an extension of India, should not consider Mauritius as a protectorate of India, because Mauritius has its own independent identity on the geopolitical map of the world. If you look at all the European colonizers, whether it is the Portuguese, whether it is the Dutch, whether it is the French, whether it is the English, they have showed up here in Mauritius. It was only in 1968 that British finally gave independence to Mauritius. But they also did something else. What they did, look at the Chagos archipelago. They separated a part of this into British Indian Territory region, and this Diego Garcia, this island was gifted to United States of America, where an important all-powerful military base was established by the United States. Mauritius for a long time was asking for sovereignty over the Chagos as well as the Diego Garcia. Ultimately, matter went to the United Nations as well. Then United Nations referred this matter to International Criminal Court as well. And finally, an advisory opinion was given by the ICC saying Mauritius has sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago. And ultimately, what happened last year in 2024, UK-Mauritius agreement was signed, under which Mauritius will have sovereignty over the Chagos, and this Diego Garcia, this island, will be given on a lease to United States of America for 99 years. These facts are very important in map-based type questions. This can be important for your prelims examination. And let's wait and watch if there is a further development on India-Mauritius relationship today. Then we will have an elaborate discussion tomorrow. Let's look at another topic. Ex-Chief Justice of India cites loopholes in bill on simultaneous polls, calls for amendment to EC powers. There is 129th Amendment Bill pending in the Parliament, which is currently being viewed and debated by the Joint Parliamentary Committee. Clear? This is the bill which talks about one nation, one election, which means we will have to synchronize our election cycle in such a manner that elections to Lok Sabha and the state legislative assemblies would be conducted at the same time. Now, this bill, as I said, is under the discussion of the Joint Parliamentary Committee, and in its report, former Chief Justice of India, who is now the nominated member of the Rajya Sabha, he has raised some concerns. And what are these concerns? According to this bill, if the Election Commission of India feels that elections to Legislative Assembly and the Lok Sabha cannot be held simultaneously with respect to a particular state, it may recommend the President, and the President will issue a notification and say that election to this Legislative Assembly will be conducted at a later date. I will repeat. According to this bill, if the Election Commission of India is satisfied that elections to the Legislative Assembly of a state and the Lok Sabha elections cannot be held simultaneously, then Election Commission of India will recommend to the President. President will issue a notification and say that election to this Legislative Assembly will be conducted at a later date. But in how many months, how many years, how many decades? This time period has not been recommended. This time period has not been provided in the bill. Members of the JPC as well as Mr. Justice Ranjan Gogoi, they have said that you are giving arbitrary, unregulated powers to the Election Commission of India by not prescribing a time period. So time period should be prescribed, amendment should be made to this bill. That's number one. Second, this article also talks about that in the previous meeting of this JPC panel, the former Chief Justice of India, Justice UU Lalit, had also raised some concerns and said prima facie the bill may not stand the test of legal scrutiny. That means maybe the bill will be declared unconstitutional. Maybe the law will be declared unconstitutional if and when it is passed. Why? Because according to this bill, and if it becomes a law, there is something called appointed date. And what is this appointed date? For example, after the Lok Sabha election, in the first session of the new Lok Sabha, the President may by public notification appoint a date called the appointed date. And this will be the date from which the simultaneous election cycle will start. Which means this is the appointed date. If the elections are conducted to the state legislative assemblies later, after this appointed date, their term will coincide with this appointed date. Which means this is the appointed date. After this appointed date, whenever elections are conducted to various state legislative assemblies, their term would be according to this appointed date. Which means even if they have 2-year term left, they will still not continue, which means they will have to synchronize with this appointed date so that next time elections take place, it will take simultaneously throughout the country. Now, former Chief Justice of India, Justice UU Lalit has said that we have to look at one aspect, substantial term and non-substantial term. Which means if this is the appointed date, let's say in 2029, then even if elections are held in 2031 or 2032, they will have a term only till 2034. Which means this will have a term of 2 years, this will have a term of 3 years. But just as UU Lalit said, we have to look at this from the perspective of substantial and non-substantial term. If the term which is remaining of a legislative assembly is 30 to 40%, that means 30 to 40% of the term of the legislative assembly is still remaining, is still left incomplete, then we will call it a substantial term, and that would make this law unconstitutional. because that would violate federalism, which is part of the basic structure of Indian constitution. Why? Because in a federal polity, center and states are there, and states are not subservient to the center. Both center and states, they derive their powers from the constitution. And if you are making the terms of these legislative assemblies subservient to the term of the Lok Sabha, this would violate federal principle if a substantial term is getting affected of that legislative assembly. These are the two concerns mentioned in this article. That's something that we have discussed. Let's move on to the topic number 3. Is rising consumer credit cause for concern? Now, the Reserve Bank of India has released its report called FSR, Financial Stability Report of 2024. Sometimes these facts are very important. Who releases the Financial Stability Report? And one of the option, if it is RBI, you have to tick the Reserve Bank of India. Now, according to this report, what is mentioned in this report? Something very interesting, something very important. Household debt of all the people residing in a house, how much of the money do they owe to the financial institutions, for example? That is the household debt. If you look at India, one important statement, the household debt is lesser as compared to other emerging economies of the world. The household debt in India is lesser as compared to other emerging markets, emerging countries of the world. But this household debt to GDP ratio is a concern. And this is increasing year on year. In 2021, it was 36.6%. Now in 2024, March 2024, it is 41%. That means household debt to GDP ratio is increasing, and this is a cause for concern. What else? When we look at borrowers, we can primarily divide borrowers into multiple categories. Multiple categories, for example, subprime borrowers, prime borrowers, above prime quality borrowers. Subprime borrowers, for example, those who will not be in a position to furnish their loans, who will not be able to repay their loans. Their strength, their financial condition is not such that they will be able to repay their loans. And you might have heard of the subprime lending crisis which happened in 2008. From 2007 onwards, which led to the global economic crisis, which led to the bankruptcy of various companies. For example, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy and multiple other banks collapsed. That was because funding or borrowing was given to these subprime lenders, subprime borrowers who are not going to repay the loan or who will find it very difficult to repay the loan. But those who are able to repay, those who have the potential of repaying, and those, the quality prime borrowers, according to this financial stability report, these are the individuals who are taking loans in large numbers, but they are primarily taking loans for asset creation, for asset building. And those who are subprime borrowers, they are taking loans, but these loans are mostly consumption oriented. And in fact, this financial stability report says more than 50% of the borrowing by these subprime borrowers, they borrow loans for consumption needs, for consumption requirements. For example, if you look at budget, budget can be a deficit budget, budget can be a surplus budget. Which type of the budget is better? Contrary to the popular belief, the deficit budget is better. That means you should be borrowing more, you should be spending more. But if you spend this for creating capital assets, for example, laying down roads, creating hospitals, creating airports, building capital assets, that is good. But if you are borrowing and spending more for subsidies or the salaries of government employees or their pensions, this is something which is not good. So deficit budget is good provided you are resorting to deficit financing to create capital assets. Similarly, if you are buying loans and these loans are primarily meant for, let's say, buying a house, buying a piece of land, creating assets, that means the household assets will increase. That is good for the economy, good for the household as well, good for the people as well. But if you are borrowing money for consumption needs, for example, to meet your day-to-day expenses, grocery expenses, funding your travel or other allied expenses, for example, medical health care, then this is a cause for concern. And financial stability report says more than half of these subprime borrowers, they are borrowing loans to primarily meet their consumption requirements. And these are the people whose household family income is less than 5 lakh rupees annually. What does this data tell us? This data tells us two things. One, is it because these people who resort to loans to meet these consumption requirements, does that mean that they have been rendered economically so fragile by the pandemic that they have no other means of financial security, which ultimately means that to fund their daily requirements, they have to opt for loans? This will mean macro economy is weak. It may also mean second thing. One, it may mean that these are the people who resort to consumption loans because they don't have financial security. They have been rendered financially insecure by maybe because of the pandemic, and they have no other option but to resort to the consumption loans. But it may also mean second, easy credit. The financial innovation that has taken place in this country, and now you are being lent money based on your credit card. You might have received an SMS, your credit card is eligible for a loan of up to 6 lakh rupees. Press 1 to opt in, press 0 to opt out. Which means on your credit card, loans are provided, and these loans are primarily meant for consumption, which primarily means that income multiplier would take an effect, would be impacted, which means you are going to keep these people in a generation of debt, which is ultimately problematic to India, which primarily means that they will have to spend a lot of their money to service these loans as well, to provide the EMIs as well, which means they will not be able to spend money on asset creation, on asset building. Although financial stability report says a large part of the loans are being borrowed by these prime and above quality borrowers, and it is indicative of the fact that most of these prime borrowers, they are borrowing money to create assets, to build assets, asset creation. But also problematic is that majority of these subprime borrowers, they are borrowing money to meet their consumption requirements. This is what we need to understand from this article. Let's look at another article. Don't stand in the way of aspirations of students, Pradhan tells Tamil Nadu government. Now you would know there is a tussle between the Union Ministry of Education and the Tamil Nadu government. What are the steps in this tussle? For example, we have a program, Samagra Shiksha. In 2018-2019 Union Budget, the Government of India said, we need one program for entire school education, which means a program for school education from preschool to class 12th. And what this Samagra Shiksha basically did, it subsumed 3 other schemes. So there was one scheme called Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. There was another scheme called Rashtriya Madhyamik Shiksha Abhiyan and teacher education. All these three schemes were subsumed under Samagra Shiksha, and this is primarily a centrally sponsored scheme. And you would know that in a centrally sponsored scheme for a general category state such as Tamil Nadu and others, the contribution is in the range of 60 to 40 is to 40. 60% will be contributed by the center, 40% will be contributed by the states. And what is the purpose? One of the objective of this Samagra Shiksha is to ensure the implementation of the recommendations of the National Education Policy of 2020. Now, these funds which were to be released by the central government to the states such as Tamil Nadu, they have been withheld. Why? Because Tamil Nadu government has not implemented the new National Education Policy of 2020. So, which means the funds under Samagra Shiksha are held because the state has failed to implement National Education Policy. And the state is saying, we are not going to implement this National Education Policy because you are insisting on Hindi. This is something which is not acceptable to us. Now, in this backdrop, let's look at few important issues. When it comes to education, you would know that education is under the concurrent list. Although initially it was passed of the union list, but during emergency in 1976, because of the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act, education was shifted from state list to concurrent list, which would basically mean that both Parliament as well as the state legislature has the power to make laws, which means both the union government as well as the state governments, they have the power to make rules regarding education in their respective states. Normally what happens is that central government, union government, it issues broad guidelines and then the state government has to implement them. Because center can ideally create a broad guideline, create a fundamental structure, but the real agency is with the states to implement these initiatives. Because without states coordination, you cannot implement any policy related to education. This is where both center as well as states such as Tamil Nadu, they need to realize. What do they need to realize? Tamil Nadu, for example, their concern for federalism is understood. But what Tamil Nadu also needs to understand is, you should implement a three-language formula. Because this three-language formula in no way means Hindi imposition. What Tamil Nadu can do, it can start teaching kids any other South Indian language, not necessarily Hindi. So it can teach English, it can teach Tamil, it can teach any other South Indian language. So implementing a three-language formula does not mean Hindi imposition. Or Tamil Nadu should well accept and leave it to the demand and supply. If there is a demand in Tamil Nadu for Hindi to be understood and taught to the kids, then Hindi should be taught. That's the democratic way of doing it. Center, on the other hand, should also understand that we can create a broad outline, a broad policy, such as the National Education Policy. But at the same time, we should allow the states to tweak this policy based on their local considerations. Because every state is unique. And you can't have one size fits all formula for the entire country, which is geographically very vast and culturally diverse, such as India. This used to be one of the criticism of the Planning Commission as well. Because Planning Commission would make policies, plans for the entire country in the form of one size fits all, bottom down approach, top down approach. So rather we should focus on, have a policy and program in place, but allow the states to tweak this policy based on their local considerations. That's number one that center will have to understand. And maybe center needs to understand one more thing. Is it necessary to spend so much time and energy on education in Tamil Nadu? Sir, what are you trying to say? I'm trying to say, look at the data. Look at the gross enrollment ratio when it comes to the secondary level. Secondary level means class 9 to 12. If you look at this gross enrollment ratio for a state such as Tamil Nadu, for a state such as UP, for a state such as Bihar, in Tamil Nadu it is 89.5, in UP it is 58.5, in Bihar it is close to 37.8. And who has given this data? This data is provided by the Union Ministry for Education. Which means look at the gross enrollment ratio in Tamil Nadu and compare it with other states. So shouldn't center be rather focusing on educationally backward states such as UP and Bihar rather than telling Tamil Nadu how you should perform in the education space? Or perhaps center needs to do something else as well. Maybe it can study the Tamil Nadu model. Maybe it can study the Kerala model. What they have done when it comes to the gross enrollment ratio. For example, Kerala, 99% gross enrollment ratio at the middle school level. Maybe the center should study this Tamil Nadu model, this Kerala model, and see if there are some lessons to be had for educationally backward states in India. That's what we need to understand from this controversy. Any questions thus far? Okay, great. What's in a disease's name? For example, Spanish flu. Basically an influenza. What is influenza? Infection of nose, throat, lungs, and this infection is primarily caused by the virus. And there was this outbreak of influenza also called Spanish flu way back in 1918 to 1920. But do you know why it is called Spanish flu? Because this was the time of the First World War. And there were two blocks. For example, one block in the First World War was Germany, Ottoman Empire. The other block was France, Britain, Russia till 1917. Then Italy also joined. Then United States also joined. All these countries in Europe, because this influenza outbreak took place in Europe mostly, all these countries who were participating in the war, they had a strong censorship regime. They did not want the news related to this flu, to this influenza being the cause for panic. The news should not spread so that it can demoralize the forces as well. That is why they suppressed information and news related to this influenza. But Spain was not allied. It was a neutral country in this war. So there was no censorship on Spain. So the Spain media would publicize, broadcast news related to influenza a lot because there was no censorship. Outside, it gave a sense as if Spain is the worst affected country because of this influenza. And also, maybe Spain is the originator of this influenza. Hence, this influenza, this flu came to be known as the Spanish flu. When you assign a name to a particular disease based on geography, based on the region, based on, let's say, a forest, based on set of people, we call such diseases as toponymous diseases. And this writer says that such diseases, they often lead to stigma prejudice. And that is why the World Health Organization in the year 2015, it said we need a scientific way of assigning names to diseases. We should not give names to the diseases based on their location or based on their people or based on ethnicity, because that is going to lead to prejudice. That is going to lead to misinformation. That is why, despite the fact that a large number of countries of the world were calling the virus of 2019 as the Chinese virus, popularized by the Donald Trump as well. But we don't officially call it the Chinese virus because you can't assign that name, because then you are stigmatizing the entire Chinese population. That is why we call it coronavirus disease. And when it came into light for the first time, it was in 2019. That is why we call it COVID-19. Otherwise, the virus is severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus. So you can't assign the name of a particular place or a region or a set of people to a particular disease because it will lead to prejudice. But this writer says something has happened recently. What has happened recently? In January, dermatologists from India and 13 other countries in the region, they objected to a name given to fungus. Set of fungus, they are responsible for very hard to treat skin disease. So there are some skin diseases which are caused by certain fungus. And this fungus, this species of fungus was given a name, Trichophyton indotinae. Why? Because the Japanese dermatologist who first unearthed this fungus, they treated it in an Indian patient. So there were patients from India and Nepal who were suffering from these skin diseases caused by this fungus. And when the Japanese dermatologist extracted this fungus, this name was given indotinae. Why? Referring to this region, India region. And that is why dermatologists from India and 13 countries in this region, they have objected to this naming. World Health Organization, it has the responsibility of assigning names to new diseases. But does WHO have the power to change the names of the existing diseases as well? Yes. If there are strong reasons, it can change the names of the existing diseases as well. For example, we had a disease which was known as Reiter's syndrome. Now, we don't call it Reiter's syndrome. What do we call it? We call it reactive arthritis. What is this reactive arthritis? There will be pain and there will be swelling. But this may also be because of the infection in other body parts. For example, there will be joint pain, arthritis. There will be swelling as well, but this may be because of the infection in other parts of the body. For example, some infection in intestines. That's what we call reactive arthritis. But the original name was Reiter syndrome. Why? Because this was named after a German physician, Hans Reiter. And he was the one who said, if there is infection in other body parts, maybe because of conjunctivitis in the eye, maybe because of urethritis, there will be a combination of urinary tract infection or conjunctivitis, which will also lead to joint pain disease or inflammation in the joints. So this triad was established by Hans Reiter. But then Hans Reiter was also accused of being very close to the Nazis. And he was also involved in some dubious medical experiments. And WHO said, now we will not call it the Reiter syndrome, we will call it the reactive arthritis. So WHO has the power not only to assign new names to the diseases, but also to change the names of the existing diseases if there is a compelling reason, if there is an exception. And that is how WHO can interfere in this manner as well, in case of this fungus being attributed to India. And that is what this article talks about. The focus of the WHO and the scientists across the world should be to focus on the origin of diseases and how do we cure these diseases, rather than assigning names which can polarize society or which can lead to prejudice. That's what's there in a name, although given by this is one of the quote of Shakespeare, but here we say what's in a disease's name. A name plays a very important role. Okay. Now let's look at another article, Building Compassion into Healthcare Structure, written by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Kailash Satyarthi. What WHO did last month in February, it released a report. And this report called for compassion. And compassion will play a very important role in primary health care. What is this compassion? For example, a study was conducted by Stanford University. What is the study? You may go to a hospital. There you will see polite doctor, impolite doctor, polite nursing staff, impolite nursing staff. Stanford University did a study and said those who are being treated by this polite doctor and polite nursing staff, they tend to recover quickly and they spend less hospitalization time. They spend less time in the hospitals. That talks about compassion. Polite, being polite to your patient. Don't be rude. Explain to them what is your medical condition. Another study was given by Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins University said whenever a doctor would spend 40 seconds extra on a patient, and this is not 40 seconds of extra treatment or extra information, 40 seconds just to give assurance to this patient, even if you're suffering from cancer, that we are in this together. What is this? Compassion. And World Health Organization now has recognized that there is a need for compassion in our primary health care. And Kailash Satyarthi says this is something that I have been advocating for a long time, and now finally WHO has woken up and has recognized the significance of compassion. But what is this compassion? I'll use a different color to differentiate. Is compassion similar to, let's say, sympathy or empathy? Because compassion, sympathy, empathy, these are the terms which are used interchangeably. Sympathy is out of pity and it has a temporary bias. That means it may be now but may not be tomorrow. Sympathy, I will have sympathy with you because of your medical condition. I will have pity on you. But empathy is when you are in someone else's shoe and you assume that whatever is happening to you is happening to me as well. And then the lines get blurred, which means your pain is my pain. That means I will get deeply affected by this. I will internalize this process. You and me will become one. For example, if you might have watched that movie, Kyunki, starring Salman Khan, Kareena Kapoor, directed by Priyadarshan. I would not have watched this movie, but I did. But I watched this movie because I read that this is a ripoff. This is a remake of a fantastic Jack Nicholson's movie named One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest. Fantastic movie. You should watch it if you have time, maybe after your exam. So this movie was basically a rip-off of One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest, and I thought, let me watch it. And I regret it even now to watch it, but you never know what can help you sometime later. And today I'm quoting the example. Maybe you have watched this movie. Kareena Kapoor was getting so much involved in a patient whose serial number was 36. Once she becomes better and she leaves the hospital, she does not even recognize Kareena Kapoor, who nurtured her, took care of her, because she had empathy for that patient. And the empathy was such that it affected her morale, it affected her self-esteem, it led her into a state of depression as well. So you should not be having empathy for the patients. You may not be even having sympathy for the patients. Sympathy is having pity. You may have compassion. Compassion is when you feel the suffering of others as your own and you try to solve it, but despite the fact you keep a close, clear boundary which you don't cross. That is compassion. Treat others with respect. And when you treat others with respect, your stress level will also reduce, because medical staff nowadays, they are under tremendous pressure. Mental pressure as well, because of the humongous work that they have to do in the hospitals, which affects their mental state as well. But if these doctors start developing compassion, it will affect their morale in a good way as well. They will have more likelihood of getting involved in their work and enjoying their work. But compassion means I will treat your problem as my own, but at the same time, I will draw a line which I will not cross. For example, as the principal, the dean, said in Munnabai MBBS, you know, this hand, rock solid. Whenever it performs surgery, it never shivers. But what if this hand is used to perform surgery on my daughter? It will shiver. So you don't need to love your parents. That was his idea. But his idea has now been debunked by WHO, which says there has to be compassion. And it's time to globalize this compassionate healthcare for all. Great. Let's look at 2 questions for your practice. Compassionate healthcare must become the driving principle for industry leaders, hospitals, and healthcare think tanks. Comment in 250 words. Mauritius is not an extension of India, despite the strong bonds of ethnic kinship. Mauritius has a geopolitical identity and agency all of its own. What do you understand by the statement? Write the answer in 250 words. And we have to wrap it up in 45 minutes. Sometimes we will take more than an hour. Sometimes we'll take 1.5 hours. Sometimes we'll take 30 minutes, 45 minutes. It all depends upon the number of topics that are important in the newspaper to be covered by us for your examination. Because our motto is to teach the civil services aspirants strictly according to the requirements of the exam, nothing more, nothing less. See you again tomorrow, 10 o'clock in the morning. Till then, have a great time. All the best. Bye-bye.